the most important news of the day, by which I mean the most important news that was revealed today, and not last night at the hearing, is that Clarence Thomas now appears to be the most corrupted member of the United States Supreme Court in the court's history, because Clarence Thomas's wife definitely is the most corrupt spouse of a Supreme Court justice in history, and she may also be a criminal, possibly guilty of federal and state crimes. The Washington Post reported today that Virginia Thomas used interstate communication to urge members of the Arizona state legislature to commit a crime, the crime of election fraud, in a federal election. That news exposes a Supreme Court justice's wife as possibly guilty of state and federal crimes. And in any other era, that would be the only news of the day. That would dominate all television news coverage, and it would be giant front page headlines all over the country tomorrow morning. But in this era of rampant Republican criminality led by Donald Trump, and including everyone from Trump all the way down to the hundreds of people who have been arrested by the FBI for acting as Donald Trump's agents at the Capitol on January 6th, a Supreme Court justice's spouse, for the first time in history, being suspected of state and federal crimes, has to compete with all the other Republican madness that has been unleashed in this country since Donald Trump became a politician, and the Republican madness that was a pre-existing condition to the Trump cancer on the Republican Party, and that is the Republican Party's decades-long, relentless determination that America's mass murderers should always be the best-equipped mass murderers in the world. And so, a Supreme Court justice's wife, possibly committing crimes, will not be our lead story in this hour tonight. The condemning revelations in last night's hearing by the January 6th committee will not be our lead story tonight, even though it revealed Ivanka Trump to be the most disloyal presidential daughter in history when she testified against her father, the most criminal president in history. We will get to all of those things, but we will begin and end tonight with guns. At the end of the hour, we'll be joined by David Hogg, who is leading the second March for Our Lives demonstration in Washington as a high school senior in 2018. He was one of the leaders of the largest march in Washington history against gun violence, particularly mass murders in our schools, after he survived the mass murder at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. We begin tonight with the gun that murdered, as we now know, in some cases, actually decapitated 19 children who bled to death on the floors of their classrooms, along with 2 of their teachers at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, and the Texas cover-up that gun has now created. The mass murderer in Las Vegas, who killed 60 people, 60, from his hotel window, was a big fan of the very same weapon, the Daniel Defense DDM V7 rifle, which the murderer in Uvalde bought when he turned 18 for $1,870. That's what he used to decapitate children. That's what a doctor who saw the bodies told us, that some of the children were decapitated by that weapon that has a family name on it. The company that makes those rifles is proudly named after its founder, Marty Daniel. So the Daniel family name is right there now in the autopsy reports of mass murders. That name got there because shortly after the company was founded 20 years ago, Mr. Daniel won a $20 million contract with the United States military to produce those war weapons for U.S. Special Forces. So those guns might not exist today if Marty Daniel didn't get that government contract. One agenda item that should be in the legislative discussions, led in the Senate now by Senator Chris Murphy, is limiting all governmental purchases of assault weapons to companies that do not sell to the retail market, companies that do not make their weapons legally available to 18-year-old mass murderers. If you want to sell weapons to the United States military or to police forces in the United States, then you cannot sell those same assault weapons to the public. That should be in law in this country. Last night, in the January 6th committee's hearing, we saw an awe-inspiring depiction of police heroism, unlike anything we have ever seen before, personified by Capitol Police Officer Caroline Edwards. She described engaging in hours of hand-to-hand combat that she was not trained for as a Capitol Police officer. And those hours of hand-to-hand combat occurred after she had already been knocked out in earlier hand-to-hand combat at the very beginning of the invasion of the Capitol. There was nothing Officer Edwards would not do to defend the Capitol. There was no attacker she would not fight to defend the Capitol. She knew she was not equipped for the fight. She did not have a shield. She did not have any tools to protect herself, but still she fought. She did not think, I'm going to wait for the National Guard to show up. I'm going to wait for better equipped riot police to show up. She did not wait for anything or anyone. She fought Donald Trump's supporters for hours in hand-to-hand combat while Donald Trump cheered them on. I think we know what Officer Caroline Edwards would have done if she were in Robb Elementary School that day. I think we know what other Capitol Police officers would have done. What Chief Pete Arredondo did was wait. Wait for an hour, over an hour, while children were bleeding to death on the floor. Wait for better equipment, safer equipment. Wait for shields. And wait for officers who were willing to do what he was not willing to do and what he did not do and what he never did. What happened inside that school is now a full-blown Texas cover-up, including everyone from the governor down to the superintendent of schools in Uvalde, who, in classic cover-up style, chose to have his first press conference after the shooting yesterday, on the day that he knew the coverage of the January 6th committee hearing would smother everything that happened in Uvalde yesterday. Hal Harrell is the superintendent of the school district there, who has the power, along with the school board, to fire the chief of the school police force, Pete Arredondo, who has a grand total of 5 police officers under his command on that tiny police force dedicated to nothing but policing the schools. When the superintendent took his first question yesterday, it was very clear he was going to play his part in the cover-up.
My question really is, do you still trust your police chief to handle responses and his duties?
That falls in line with some personnel. And I'm not going to comment on, I cannot comment in open.
It's not asking about personnel, it's asking you, what is your feeling? It's not a personnel. Do you have confidence in his abilities?
He's lying. Nothing prevents him from answering that question. Absolutely nothing. Here is NBC's Morgan Chesky.
Can you confirm if Mr. Arredondo is still a district employee? And if so, have you communicated with him at all?
That's a personnel question. I'm not going to be able to answer that in a public forum.
That is another lie. Superintendent Harrell can answer that question and is refusing to answer that question because he is playing his part, at least for now, in the cover-up. Governor Greg Abbott publicly complained about being lied to on his first day in Uvalde, the day after the shooting. The Texas Tribune now reports that Chief Arredondo briefed state officials, these state officials who then, of course, briefed the governor. The Texas Tribune reports, quote, Abbott on Wednesday declined to identify who had misled him, saying only that the bad information had come from public officials. Governor Abbott could help expose the cover-up by telling us who those public officials are. Governor Abbott could fire those public officials, but Governor Abbott wants the cover-up to continue 5 more months until Election Day, November 8th in Texas. And so Governor Abbott is not going to fire anyone that he says he is livid at, that's his word, livid for lying to him. The worst police work imaginable occurred at that school, and no one has been fired, and no one has had the decency to resign. Brilliant reporting by David Goodman in the New York Times is piercing the cover-up. He reported yesterday that Chief Arredondo had no radio with him when he went into the school. Some of the children and at least one of the teachers were still alive when Border Patrol officers, without any help from Chief Arredondo, finally rushed into the classroom and instantly killed the mass murderer. The Times reports, quote, Xavier Lopez, 10, was one of the children who died after being rushed to a hospital. His family said he had been shot in the back and lost a lot of blood as he awaited medical attention. He could have been saved, his grandfather, Leonard Sandoval, said. The police did not go in for more than an hour. He bled out. According to transcripts of police body camera recordings obtained by the Times, Chief Arredondo knew that not everyone in the classrooms was dead. While they were waiting outside, Arredondo said, "We think there are some injuries in there." The Times describes what it calls a cascade of failures inside the school, including the fact that police radios don't work inside the school or don't work well enough for good communication inside the school. It is impossible to think of a more profound level of incompetence than Chief Arredondo allowing the school police force to be equipped with radios that do not work, the only place they really have to work, which is inside schools in Uvalde. He should be fired for that incompetence alone, even if there were no school shootings in Uvalde. School police radios that do not work inside schools is the fault of Chief Arredondo. It is the fault of the superintendent, Harrell, and every member of that school board. The complete failure of police communication that day inside the school is the fault of all of those people, and that is why there is a cover-up. Everyone involved in the cover-up is at fault and has something to hide. After David Goodman's piercing of the cover-up in the New York Times, showing that Chief Arredondo was at fault for more than just waiting outside the classroom, the Texas Tribune published suddenly the first interview with Chief Arredondo since the shooting. It was a defensive interview with Chief Arredondo's criminal defense lawyer, George E. Hyde, participating in the interview. The chief was not asked why he has a criminal defense lawyer now. Some of the interview was conducted by phone, some in written answers, and all with the guidance of Arredondo's lawyer. Arredondo said he was not aware of the 911 calls because he did not have his radio and no one in the hallway relayed that information to him. He said he never considered himself the scene's incident commander. I didn't issue any orders, Arredondo said. I called for assistance and asked for an extraction tool to open the door, but Arredondo had also asked for keys that could open the door. Unlike some other school district police departments, Uvalde school district officers don't carry master keys to the schools they visit. They don't visit schools, they police those schools, and 19 children are dead because it never occurred to the chief of police of the schools that school police should have master keys to all of the classrooms in all of the schools. A school police chief must be fired just for that. And Arredondo's telling about 30 different keys were brought to him during the hour, keys that didn't work on the classroom door. And then the Border Patrol officers obtained a key that did work, according to Arredondo, without any input from him. They then rushed into the classroom and killed the mass murderer. The Texas Tribune reports, quote, the day after the shooting, Arredondo and other local officials stood behind Governor Greg Abbott and Public Safety Director Steve McCraw as they held their first major news conference to address the slaughter. Now Arredondo is refusing to communicate with any of those people who he stood with that day, refusing to communicate with the State Department of Public Safety and their investigation. Quote, after McCraw said at a press conference on May 27th that Arredondo made the wrong decision, the police chief no longer participated in the investigation to avoid media interference, Mr. Hyde said. So there's Chief Arredondo's criminal defense lawyer, somehow trying to blame the media for Arredondo no longer participating in the police investigation of what happened at that school. It is a secret investigation. Obviously, Arredondo's criminal defense lawyer has advised him not to answer any questions in that investigation, and that's why he's not answering questions.